I have the pleasure. Thank you. I have the pleasure now of introducing a former colleague, Eric Biel. Eric and I worked closely together when he was our Deputy Washington Director and Senior Counsel, and after leaving Human Rights First, he became Managing Director for Corporate Responsibility at Burson Marsteller, and then he joined the Bureau of International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor, where he is now. So we're very pleased to have him here. But before I turn it over to Eric, you may have noticed that there's another former colleague on this panel. More accurately, a former boss and the guy who gave me my start in the human rights world, Mike Posner, the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I just wanted to make a special recognition of Mike, who is my hero and mentor. And I'm not the only one who feels that way, I know, in this room and far, far beyond. And I'm very grateful to him for this is... We are practically a flyover for Mike right now, who landed last night from God knows where and is taking off this afternoon for another place of such description. So I'm very, very grateful that he made the time to join us, and all of our panelists, including Eric, who I will turn it over to now. Thanks.
Mic on? Do I need to touch anything to get the mic on? Okay, sorry.
Oh, now it's on.
Okay, how about now? Great. Well, I want to thank Elisa for the introduction. Thank Meg Rogensack, with whom a number of us here have worked closely on business and human rights issues. I understand it's been a terrific first day and a half of the summit, and I look forward to participating in some events later today. It's a great distinguished panel. Christine Bader will be introducing Marcela, Mike, Elliot, and Mike Garland in more detail shortly. My little job here, and I hope there's a timer on me for no more than 4 or 5 minutes, is to provide a little bit of background and context for the discussion that Christine will be moderating with the other panelists, based on the assumption that not all of you in this room have been immersed in the lively world of business and human rights, corporate citizenship, corporate accountability, whatever you may want to call it, over the last decade or more, as all the panelists have been. So I want to provide a little context for the discussion, while noting that we're going to really try not to be overly theoretical in this discussion. The goal here, having outlined some of the framing and some of the concepts in the next few minutes, is to really get down to practical application of some of the framework and the tools and so forth, and not merely talk about this at 30,000 feet. I am here, and as Elisa mentioned, in the capacity of a U.S. government official, as the Associate Deputy Undersecretary, a long and strange title at the International Labor Affairs Bureau. But just to be clear, the lead responsibility in the U.S. government for the issues we're going to be discussing is the State Department, and specifically the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, led by Mike Posner. And Mike is just back from Geneva, where about 1,000 of our closest friends have gathered for a big conference program to talk about some of the issues that this panel will be discussing this morning and early afternoon. So let me kind of cut to the chase in terms of the overview, recognizing we'll get into more details in the discussion that follows. The starting point is you're going to hear a lot about something called the UN Guiding Principles. This is what's at the framework at the heart of the meeting in Geneva that Mike's just come back from. You'll be hearing the name Professor John Ruggie, or Special Representative John Ruggie. John Ruggie is a longtime professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's also served in previous capacities at the United Nations, and in 2005, then Secretary General Kofi Annan tapped him as the first ever UN Special Representative on business and human rights. And in fact, Christine was part of what came to be known colloquially as Team Ruggie, a very small, dedicated group getting by on no official budget that managed over the course of 5 years in kind of 2 installments to deliver the guiding principles that were approved by the UN Council, Human Rights Council, in June 2011, and that have prompted a lot of the discussion that follows on the overall framework, due diligence principles, and so on and so forth. John and his team inherited issues that were not new when he came on board in 2005. There had been a lot of work done in the OECD and the International Labor Organization, and there had also been a previous UN effort under the auspices of the Subcommission on Human Rights and Professor David Weisbrot at University of Minnesota that had produced the draft norms on transnational corporations after a 3-year effort culminating in 2003, but also created, frankly, some deep schisms between the business community and civil society and labor and so forth in terms of how those principles might work, their applicability, and so on and so forth. In addition, by the time John Ruggie came on board in his special representative capacity in 2005, 2006, there was a lot of other work underway that you're going to be hearing some examples of. For example, multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Apparel Industry Partnership, launched under the umbrella of the Clinton administration, which became the Fair Labor Association that Mike was a key participant in, Marcel has been a key participant in, Jorge Perez Lopez, who's here as the current executive director of, that has really been cutting edge in terms of the development of guidelines, principles, and implementation mechanisms in the apparel sector, and now is broadening beyond the apparel sector. The Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, which was an initiative of the second term of the Clinton administration and launched at I think the very last day in January 2001 by the Clinton administration, so it's been around for about 11 years. There were also a number of other initiatives. There was a lot of ferment broadly on the concept of voluntary self-regulation. Elliot, in one of his previous capacities at Gap, was a leader in the development of tools that companies were implementing to deal with their supply chains, and that has only grown and proliferated and gotten much stronger in many respects over the last decade. And there was increased focus on these issues in terms of corporate accountability in this country, in terms of what's the third pillar of the Ruggie framework, remedies, specifically with a number of lawsuits that had been brought starting in the late 1990s under the Alien Tort Statute, the Alien Tort Claims Act, which had been the vehicle for some lawsuits against non-corporate actors, former government officials going back to 1979, 1980. But starting in the late 90s, there started to be lawsuits against companies, particularly in the energy and extractive sector. And so there was a whole debate flourishing by the time Ruggie started his work about not only those kind of remedies, but also non-judicial remedies for violations of human rights. Some of you may know that there is a case pending before the Supreme Court that was argued at the beginning of October, Kiobel versus Shell, that will probably be the definitive moment in terms of jurisprudence in this country on whether these kind of lawsuits against corporate defendants can move forward, civil lawsuits. So when Ruggie came on board, there was a lot of work already done, but what Ruggie and his team, including Christine, did was try to heal some of the schisms that had developed in the aftermath of the draft norms, and they developed a process that, as I mentioned, led to the guidelines that were finalized in 2011. Final comment. The guidelines, and different people have explained this different ways. I'm sure Mike talked about them much more articulately yesterday in Geneva than I will in the next 30 seconds here. But the guidelines offer a framework. As some have said, they're a floor, not a ceiling. They're a set of core principles, but they shouldn't be seen as a replacement for more specific initiatives, such as the ones I've already mentioned, the Global Network Initiative, which has involved information technology companies, and I'm sure we'll be talking about today, and so forth. So as we talk about the guiding principles, that's one piece of the puzzle, but there are a lot more industry-specific, sector-specific, multi-stakeholder initiatives that are part of the conversation as well. There also are some efforts by the U.S. government. The State Department DRL tabled in Geneva some of the accomplishments and the achievements to date of the U.S. government, including under the Dodd-Frank law, Section 1502, dealing with conflict minerals in the supply chain. That may be part of the discussion as well. So with that, hopefully that very quick framework, for those of you who've never heard the names John Ruggie, the Guiding Principles, GNI, and others, will give you some sense of what the panel's talking about. As I said, the goal today is not to talk at a highly theoretical level, but really to get into a practical discussion and begin to share with you and get your input on innovations and how we may move this conversation about business and human rights forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine Bader. I've mentioned a couple times already. Christine has a very diverse background, both in the business sector, nonprofit sector. She was part of the Ruggie team, and she is currently senior fellow at the Kenan Institute at Duke University, and a constant blogger and writer on all things business and human rights. You can find her stuff on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center site and a lot of other places. Christine.
Eric, thank you. Thank you for that context. And Thank you, everybody, for letting us compete with your lunch. So my role here is really just to identify our panelists, to facilitate a conversation between them, and to help make sure that we accomplish the goal of this hour, which is to understand, as Eric said, very specifically, what are companies doing to promote human rights and also to identify and mitigate risks to human rights. And then also to have a discussion about whether that is efficient and effective. And then to have a conversation about what role other stakeholders should be playing in making sure that companies are both partners in championing human rights around the world, and then also making sure that they are not committing, causing, contributing to, facilitating, or enabling human rights abuses. So with that, let me just identify briefly our panelists. We have Marcela Manubens, who is recently the former head of corporate responsibility and human rights at PVH, whose brands include Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Izod, and others. She's also the chair of the Global Social Compliance Program, which is a supply chain initiative that we might hear a bit about today. Of course, Assistant Secretary of State Mike Posner, who I think needs no further introduction. Elliot Schrage is the Vice President of Global Communications, Marketing, and Public Policy at Facebook, has also worked at Google and The Gap, and was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and taught business and human rights at Columbia. Mike Garland is the Assistant Comptroller for the New York City, the steward of the New York City pension funds, which of course are the pension funds for New York City employees, and the pension funds total about $120 billion. And the New York City Comptroller's Office has really been a leader in being an activist shareholder. And so Mike oversees the environment and social and governance engagement that the Comptroller's Office has with the companies that they hold. So we'll hear about the role of investors today. Okay, so in order to get to specific solutions that stakeholders should play in making sure that companies promote human rights, we need to spend a couple minutes understanding what the problem is. So I'm going to ask a couple of our panelists to chime in so that we all understand what the problem is and why we're talking about this. So, Mike, do you want to start and talk about the state of the world today? What's the problem? And
How much
just
time?
a brief, a couple minutes.
It's very confused, the world. If I can, I just want to, I don't want to interrupt the conversation, but I want to say two words just more broadly. One is a shout out to Elisa and the board and staff, Meg, others at Human Rights First for having this meeting and for all the great work you're doing. I couldn't be more proud of everything you're doing. Second thing, I'm not going to have a chance, I'm not going to be here tonight, but I'm really so thrilled that you're honoring the memory and the legacy of Chris Stevens. I had the privilege of working with him, and in fact, I was with him his first week in Libya. We had first week on the job as ambassador, and he knew the country well. He had served there previously, but he was such a welcome presence there. We had a human rights dialogue with the then interim government, and I saw really up close with Chris how important it is to have diplomats in the field who are thoughtful and connect to people. And one of the things that really Libya's brought home, so many other places I've traveled, is the relationship of the State Department, where we take some risks, but with our military, I see Charlie Odstad here. I know Jill and Elisa and I worked with a lot of military leaders. I'm more and more convinced in the work I do of the tremendous synergy and the interdependence of our military and our diplomatic corps. It's a very complicated world in answer to your question, and we're not going to solve it purely with military solutions or with diplomatic solutions. We need to do both, and we need to integrate economics into it. And so part of what this discussion is about in the broader sense is that our government is trying to figure out how to navigate in a 21st century world where things are both more connected economically, politically, in terms of security or lack of security, but also where we're dealing with new actors on the scene. And one of the things I said in Geneva yesterday, and to me it's the starting point for governments. I say this a lot in-house in the State Department. You know, when Eleanor Roosevelt led the effort on the Universal Declaration for Human Rights 64 years ago, it was a world of states. States negotiated with each other and basically said, these are the things that states need to do to protect people. The role of the state is still hugely important, and the United States is by far the most important government in the world, most powerful economically and politically, but governments are less powerful. We have the threats to our security of al-Qaeda and other extremist groups who have no allegiance to states. We have an NGO world. Human Rights First is part of a ballooning of NGOs doing all sorts of things that in 1948 only governments did. And then we have companies, global companies now. If you look at the 100 biggest economies in the world, 50 of them are not states, they're companies. Walmart's the 31st biggest economy in the world. And so for all of us, I think, for government to recognize we're not alone, we need to figure out how do we interact with a global economy where there's these huge economic actors who are not, frankly, diplomats. They're trying to do their job. We have to help them succeed on economic terms, but we've also got to help them understand the world in which they're operating. And for us, it's hard. And I think, for me, the Ruggie principles, and I'm going to stop with this one comment, the guiding principles, you know, people keep saying, oh, the guiding principles. The guiding principles, to me, are a very elegant throat-clearing exercise. Basically, what John Ruggie did is to take a big disparate field and say, you know what, this is a subject the world has to tackle. And he has certain obligations for states, you know, duty to protect, certain obligations for companies, responsibility to respect, and then there have to be some remedies. That is a beginning of a conversation. It's a justification for what each of us now have to do. And so I think we're at the very beginning of a very big, important conversation. But what governments do, what companies do, what the NGO world does is now up for grabs. And we really have to assume there's a big agenda, and each of us in our own way have to figure out how do we reinvent ourselves, reinvent government, reinvent thoughts about what the corporate sector does in the 21st century, and reinvent, frankly, what some of the NGOs are doing.
Great, Mike, thank you. Okay, so it's
Can I pick up on that?
exactly. I was just going to turn to you. So it's a scary new world with non-state actors, and
I don't know if I'd call it again. So if we're all going to start with the thanks, I think again, it's for me personally, it's really an extraordinary honor to be here. I've worked on these issues for a very long time, and my career, just like Elisa's, really began as a law. This is actually for the students here, as a law school student, traveling on a human rights mission to Africa. Well, actually more than that, but the high point of my law school career was traveling on a human rights mission to Africa with Mike. Not only did we accomplish a tremendous amount of research and inquiry in Zimbabwe and Kenya, in Uganda under, as Mike will remember, extraordinarily dangerous circumstances. We also made it back in time to watch the Chicago Bears win the Super Bowl. And for those of you who know of Mike's Chicago passion, I'm also a Chicago guy. The fact that we were able to combine both of those was also a particular high point. But I say it's not a scary time because, as Mike mentioned earlier, and he introduced it really well. It's this idea that partners, unlikely partners, are more effective together. Some of the best ways to advance diplomatic solutions, as he suggested, is by working closely with the military. And historically, those kinds of relationships around issues of human rights might not have been first in mind. And I think my perspective is, I think the business community and the private sector is another form of advancing human rights, communicating democratic values, advancing the national interests of this country, particularly the global businesses that are based here, not simply to mitigate risk, but to really advance and promote human rights. And I really think it's important that everyone recognize that what Mike has done and what the State Department under Secretary Clinton have done is to really begin to reorient the relationship between the diplomatic community, the state community, and the private sector away from this idea of an adversarial nature where business is doing bad and needs to be corrected, towards a partnership approach where business and government can work together to, as Mike suggests, to identify challenges and overcome them.
Elliot,
and
give
we've
us
seen
some-
that. And a
give us
perfect
some-
example, some
yeah.
very concrete examples.
Yeah.
So, so Facebook, so I work at Facebook now, I work in the internet sector before I was at Google. So I'm not allowed to come to a human rights conference without saying that I think the internet is probably the most important tool for the advancement of human rights that has existed in my lifetime and will exist in my lifetime and maybe even the lifetime of everybody here in the room. I don't know how young the youngest person is. But what we've done and what this technology has enabled is for the democratization of information, for profound sharing and association, for organization, for protest, for accountability, for transparency, than I would say has ever existed in the history of this planet. And so when that is threatened, we have worked very hard to try to address that. So there are lots of examples. An example that has gotten some attention is in the Arab Spring in Tunisia. We were, and Facebook and other technologies like ours, were incredibly important in the Arab Spring, not essential, but just valuable in helping people share information, communicate about their governments, and communicate to their governments. And in Tunisia, one of the challenges we faced was there were forces, we believe, it's been reported that it was the Tunisian government, was intercepting communications and logging in through sort of nefarious means to get people's passwords, to intercept private communications in a way that threatened people's ability to express themselves and associate. And so so we really did two things. From a purely technological standpoint, we innovated to offer what's called HTTPS protocols. You want specifics, I'll give you specifics. To ensure the privacy and the encryption of communication, to make it much more difficult for that interception to take place. And then beyond that, for people whose passwords had essentially been stolen, we added a special process within in Tunisia so that people couldn't log in using their passwords alone. They actually had to recognize their friends. And if they couldn't recognize their friends, they couldn't log into their accounts. And if it is your account, you know who your friends are and you can do it. And if you don't, if you're a member of an intelligence establishment, you don't know the names of the friends and you couldn't. And so that's the kind of example that we see that where the private sector, where we as a company can really work to advance human rights. Much more generally, I feel like for us, there's so many more things that can be done. I'd say we've only begun to scratch the surface of how these technologies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, others, can be used to do an even better job promoting and advancing human rights.
Well, Elliot, thank you for that. I mean, let me bring Mike Garland in here too. So, Elliot, this sounds like Facebook's reacting in great ways and exploring opportunities. This sounds like a great investment, Mike. So, what are your concerns?
We're a great investment. A great investment.
What are your concerns, Mike? And what?
Well, we own Facebook, and we own about 3,500 other U.S. companies and another 4,000 non-U.S. companies. And let me tell you why we care. And because of the nature of who and what we are like some investors and unlike a lot of others. The City Comptroller is the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. We provide benefits, as Christine mentioned, to a worker who is hired today and retires in 30 years, and then may live another 30 years. So we have a very long-term time horizon. So in addition, we're a universal owner, and because of our time horizon and our investment strategy, which is we essentially invest through index funds, if we don't like a management or board or are uncomfortable with a particular practice, it's not easy for us to sell a company. So our only way to protect or create value is to engage our portfolio companies to make sure they have policies, practices, and disclosure in place that allows us to identify risk. And we have a long history on a very broad range of financial and non-financial risks. I won't go into it now, but so we want to make sure that Facebook is addressing risks that may harm our investment over the long term. I would mention that we have a long history of prohibiting workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The city funds led the way, 25 years ago or 20 years ago, and having companies adopt the McBride principles in Ireland to protect workers there. There's a growing body of empirical research that actually says that companies that are early adopters of responsible practices on a whole range of environmental, labor, human rights issues actually perform better over the long term. There's a very important study that came out of the Harvard Business School last November by Robert Eccles and a couple co-authors, and they looked at 180 companies over 18 years and found that companies that have responsible practices, and they basically what they did is they took the companies and they put them in either a high sustainability basket or a low sustainability basket defined by their practices and policies and their transparency. They found that the high sustainability companies significantly outperformed low sustainability companies over that time period, both on share price performance and also profitability. To come back to Facebook specifically, because we have such a broad portfolio and we episodically might look at a particular company's business strategy, but we're most concerned with making sure that there's a uniform standard of disclosure, policies, practices, that companies comply with international norms and don't expose themselves to financial risk, reputational risk, operational risk, and where I think for this discussion that becomes most relevant in terms of our recent work, it's around supply chain transparency, because I think we recognize that that's where some of the most significant risks are. I think companies wrestle with how to manage those risks. We think there are not only reputational issues involved, but can be operational risks, and this is your supply chain. And so, in the last couple of years, we have been engaging a set of companies around increasing the transparency of their supply chain, and very specifically, we believe a rigorous independent audit programs necessary and international codes of conduct. But we've been beginning to ask companies who already produce what we call a sustainability report, a GRI report, which hopefully is a meaningful report, to actually require or encourage their suppliers to do that. Because even if you have a good, I think, monitoring program in place, it's just not sufficient. And so by both trying to push transparency down into your suppliers, it allows not only investors but other stakeholders to have some accountability. I also think if you ask a company to report on a series of safety metrics and other metrics, it forces them to put systems in place and they manage those things better. They wouldn't otherwise focus on them. So.
Like, that's great. And so thank you for bringing up supply chains. I think that's a great opportunity to bring Marcela in. But can I just ask you one thing that you said? You said that it's difficult for you to sell specific company holdings. Is that right? So what leverage do you have? Why should a company listen to you if there's not a threat that you're going to sell?
I think that we're the fifth largest public fund in the country, so we are a big investor. The reality is we don't own more than 0.5% of any company, and I think our voice, we have a greater ability to create change through our voice and our shareholder rights than by selling. I just don't think that, it's very hard to sell anyway, but so the tools, we can engage through filing shareholder proposals. We file about 6 a year. Other investors vote on those. We vote on other investors' proposals. We engage in dialogue with companies. We up into actually voting against directors. Massey Energy, where a couple of years ago there was a mining disaster in this country that killed 29 workers, and the company lost half its value overnight. A group of investors banded together and led a campaign to remove a set of directors. And so we work in collaboration. I guess that's the other piece. I mean, we can't do it alone. We don't have that level of influence, but we do have influence and have constructive relationships with many companies.
Okay, Thank you for that. So, Marcela, having fielded lots of inquiries from investors over your 20 years with PVH,
Well, it
Can
sounds
I
like
have
that.
one
Yeah.
last thing? I'm sorry.
Sure.
The other piece here is working with companies around their executive compensation to try and get management's interests aligned with the longer term interests of the corporation and its shareholders. And so, because I think executive pay is sort of the nexus of governance and all kinds of business strategies. You know, people do what you pay them to do. And if you could even build into a pay package, making sure, you know, a company that has a big global footprint, that management is compensated based on the right metrics to get the right kinds of practices. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So what you, Mike, said in reference to that you have a percentage of a company, a small percentage, looks very much like supply chains. And let me see how I can make the link from the business point of view. You know, Elliot talked to you about, you know, a product. I mean, Google, a product, a service that has transformed and has helped promote human rights and democracy. Mike talked to you about investments. I mean, how he sees investments, this whole school of socially responsible investors that, by the way, I mean, is coming and growing, but it's not mainstream. It's still a very small percentage of what, you know, investors do. And then, if I were to say so, I work until very recently, and my career has been mostly within the apparel and footwear industry. I won't ask you to do it right now, but if you go tonight home and you start taking your clothing off and you, I don't know if you check the label of where it has been made, but most likely, like if you have 10 items on you, you're gonna come with 10 different countries. The reality is that companies who are in this field, we talk about the global economy, are producing and manufacturing in a large percentage of countries. You know, in our industry, it's not unknown that you manufacture, you know, it's common practice for larger companies to produce maybe in 50 countries, to market in 100 countries, or perhaps more. So when you look, you put on a screen of human rights into the operations and business that you do, it's a very complex picture. You talk about, you know, much of what Mike was saying is how he measures the companies. And you know, Christine was asking us, well, what do you think is sort of, you know, wrong right now, or what is, you know, what is the problem? And I think that one of the problems that I will have is both at the structural level and foundation of the companies, as well as what happened in many of the countries. At the structural level, you know, companies are, and when our whole school of thought was, you know, developed, there were a purist approach. There was the approach that says, you know, human rights, you know, is business have nothing to do with that. And the other school of thought that says it has to be involved. I adhere to the latter. Because I think that when someone buys in my company or in my former company, this is very difficult. When someone makes a business decision, it's not about quality, quantity, logistics, and all the rest, but it's about that, and it's about human and labor rights in the business formula. As part, as an integral part of the business formula. How do you gain that leverage as a company? I often said that, yeah, we were one of the first programs and industries in the programs in the industry in the world, but we weren't rewarded by consumers to do that. I'm not sure, Mike, that you had the information that you needed to say, well, this company is doing much better than the other company. And when we look into Wall Street, it's a very fast, you know, short-term vision. You have heard about, you know, a policy of investment that is very different than what it happens most often mainstream. So what we are not having, I mean, when we look at business, I believe that it has a triple bottom line, a share value, right? It has an economic impact, and it's not only the money that the corporation is making, but think about those jobs that is being generated throughout employment throughout the world. It has a social element of it. In our industry, the majority of the workforce are women. So how can you ignore an issue like women's rights, right? Who was our first lady in the 90s in Beijing says, women's rights are human rights. and women's rights are human rights. And we move into that for the first time. We were really addressing this, in a sort of choppy kind of way through our business in all these different political and social and cultural environments, right? But then we come into, I have the privilege to be with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the APEC last year, in the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, and she pushed the envelope even forward. Economic opportunities. Economic opportunities are women opportunities. We know that women transform and press forward sort of interests that they have not been there before, and it's not a gender issue. I love this of Secretary of State. She said, don't make the mistake to make it a gender issue. It's an opportunity. And so when we look into that and you take all these concepts and we try to put it in the supply chain, how does it look like? Well, in the early 90s, I remember through the dialogue that Elliot talked about, there was a very adamant, activist that was checking the garbage in the factories, sort of looking and demonstrating that women were tested for pregnancy as a requirement for employment. And we dealt that with the company. We addressed the issues, and I was very interested in Central America because in certain countries it was totally prohibited. In other countries it was permissive. The legislation was silent. And in other countries it was actually, there was a prescription for that. So from that element to now advance issues, economic opportunity for women transform. Simple issues, again, supply chain. You may think that this is just inconsequential, but in many parts of the world, the fact that you move from paying in cash every 2 weeks, you move into opening bank accounts and being able to have the basic, financial literacy training. And you give those opportunities is transformational. So I'm going to leave it like that because you know that I'm going to continue getting very passionate about this, and I can even compete with Elliot, which is very difficult to do.
So Marcela, thank you for that. Let me follow up with a sort of two-part question on what you said.
Okay.
So the first part is you talked about how the vision that companies should be striving for is that social issues and human rights are incorporated into business decisions.
Yeah.
Can you share maybe a specific example of an issue or a business process that you
Yes.
saw change over your time at PVH? How that became incorporated. And the second part to the question is, what are some of the impediments? What are the challenges to making that happen in a more thorough way? And you've got lots of experience getting to know other companies as well. What do you think the biggest impediment is for companies to make better decisions and incorporate human rights? And then that'll help transition us into some solutions.
Well, the economic foundation or formula that I told you is very critical. But I'll give you one example that comes from another company. We talk about this short-term vision. There are some companies, I can quote right now, Paul Polman of Unilever. He made the bold decision when he went to Unilever to say, no more estimates. Estimates, quarterly estimates for our investors, just bring only short-term investors. So he made a very bold decision. Nobody else was doing it. And as a result of that, the shares initially plummeted or declined. But it was the conviction of that CEO and that board of directors and that company that this was the way to go. And as of the art standing right now, it has done incredibly well, transformed. And because they took that position, some other companies are coming around and doing it. So think about that transformation and think about what that means from a board of directors and a CEO that it has to compete. It sort of takes away this idea that in order to compete, you need to be so price-driven, profit-driven that that's your bottom line to satisfy your shareholders. So that's one point. Issues that have changed. I think that, Eric, we were just talking about, the State Department has had incredible, the Department of Labor and you, Mike, have incredible, impact in addressing some issues. But most particularly, Bangladesh. I want to address Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a very, has grown exponentially in terms of manufacturing of apparel. particularly 3 years ago when China's prices start increasing and we have an economic crisis, a large percentage of those business of sourcing moved to Bangladesh. Just think about that. Before that happened, they were almost at maxing up the capacity in the country. So right now you have all this incredible inflow of business. In 1 year, they increased their exports by 40%. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that by putting production in places that they are not safe. You know, you have tenements buildings, you have, you know, all of a sudden a residential building with shaky, structure, that you have machinery, you have all the things, and Bangladesh doesn't have much, a very stable source of energy. So you have all these incredible gypsy, lines all over. Just go to Bangladesh and look up and you may not be able to see the sky. So in that environment, in 2011, for the first time in my career, we were in a factory that had a fire. And unfortunately, that fire, as a result of that, there were 29 deaths in that factory. I alert you, it wasn't the worst factory in Bangladesh. Actually, it was one of perhaps the better factories in Bangladesh. And as the companies were getting together, it was the issue of transparency that was addressed early on. It was very difficult. I mean, companies were like, oh, I'm not there, I'm not there. So we had to really look, we knew we were there. So once that we established who were there, we were going to start taking steps. There was a group of NGOs from the north and people who I know very well, Clean Clothes Campaign, WRC, MSN, ILRF, and I'm forgetting someone that I don't want to forget. Industrial was now, is now Industrial, the union. And they sent a letter to the brands that says, wait a minute, don't act, we want to tell you what we think. And their requirements, as it was perceived requirements, they were twofold. One was, what do you do with the victims and the people who have perished and their families in the factory? And the other workflow or work stream and requirements was, what do you do moving forward to prevent it? Because we have been here before. So to make a long story short, I mean, there wasn't much of an appetite for companies and for people to engage in this discussion, similar to probably what we experienced in the 90s with the, sweatshop exposés. But we continue forward. We were, we were certainly convinced that we needed a stakeholder discussion. Again, what Mike and Eric have been, addressing and promoting. So there was this discussion, but it wasn't a perfect discussion. And I had to tell you, in June last year, 2011, I wasn't totally comfortable that if one company were to sign an MOU, without that consensus and critical mass, that it was going to be effective. And that's what I said. But then we continue going to December 2011, and there is another tragedy. And the work that we have started with several companies early on, and it was significant work of training, etc. We even 12 companies, huge retailers, were addressing issues with over 200 suppliers, the most important in the country, and manufacturers associations. None of that really resulted in convergence and this stakeholder approach. So in December 2011, we engaged in that negotiation. Many thought that it was because of a result of the loss that we had suffered. One of our brands and factory wasn't. It was the realization that they were right, that my colleagues in civil society group, when they said if one company doesn't sign that, no one is going to do it, I came to the realization that they were totally right. And we engaged in this process of negotiation that was terrific. I mean, it's a process of negotiation that I would call it more as meeting of the minds. And that meeting of the minds resulted in a unique first-time MOU on fire safety and prevention in Bangladesh. My lesson learned in that process, you asked me what was the example, is that if we could all have that incredible transparent, dialogue, and the trust that requires to sit down with civil society and activists, people that criticize, many of you, I mean, this is a privileged auditorium, many of you are going to address issues, and I thank you for that in advance. Because if we can build that trust, what happened later on in the MOU was Let us just make it happen. What would it take to really transform that? So that, for me, has been my 2011 amazing experience, and that we are in the midst to continue promoting and engaging others.
That's great, Marcela. I mean, I think that gives a great vision of what we're striving for. So why aren't we there? What are some of the impediments? And so, Mike, what should the U.S. government be doing to get us there?
Well, just a postscript on the story in Bangladesh. There was a fire in a factory about 3 weeks ago, and 120 people died. And two things happened, which I think are reflective of where we need to go. One is that probably 10 years ago, and maybe even 5 years ago, the people who deal with Bangladesh as diplomats would have thought, well, this is a domestic matter. It doesn't involve us. We don't know how to deal with these things. My colleague in the South Asia Bureau came to a meeting 10 days ago with Secretary Clinton and said, we have to take responsibility for this. And so two things happened. One is that he convened with our help, a meeting of 50 American brands, companies who are doing business in Bangladesh, a phone call which took place this Monday, to talk about what's the collective response, very much building on what Marcela talked about. The second thing is that he's going out there. We've got a delegation going to meet with the government. And the key to me on this sort of an issue is that there isn't one answer. The brands, the buyers are going to have a certain level of influence. But at the end of the day, this is also about what's the government's responsibility, and its responsibility to allow workers to have the ability to determine their own destiny. We had the fire in Bangladesh in some ways was eerily reminiscent of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City 100 years ago. Overcrowded conditions, doors were locked, there weren't enough ways in and out. At the end of the day, people who were working in that factory have very little say over their own working conditions. So we can impose some or put some pressure on through the brands and through our diplomacy, but our diplomacy also has to be aimed at making sure that the governments operate according to their own laws and really allow workers to have a say in their own destiny.
If I could just pick up on that just from a completely different perspective. I just think that's such an important point, that our diplomacy, our society has to use the leverage that we have to communicate around the world, that the rule of law is important, that when countries make commitments, they need to comply with their own commitments, that we're committed, whether it's in the diplomatic side, on the private sector side, to support their respect for the rule of law. And if the laws that they have aren't consistent with the values that we think are important, as expressed in the Universal Declaration, then we need to get them and the civil society in those countries to support it. Again, moving away, I mean, we can go back to apparel, but on the internet side, that's a huge worry for me. My concern is that there are governments and societies around the world that view this technology as a threat, and that aren't interested in encouraging people to use these technologies to express themselves, associate, share information. And we need allies, not just from governments, not just from private sector, but from civil society in this country and around the world, to hold those governments accountable, either to the commitments that they've made to expression and association, because lots of them have great laws, or where the laws aren't great, to change those laws. And we can't have a conversation on business and human rights, or I can't sit on a panel like this without making reference to what's going on in Dubai. There is a conversation taking place. I can't say this very moment because they may be sleeping, but there's a conversation taking place in Dubai right now that really threatens to undermine human rights, and where it's a great example of partnership, where the United States has been great as a government, and the private sector is frighteningly unified in terms of the internet sector, but where there are stakeholders and governments in particular, and international organizations that would absolutely undermine the future of this technology and its use. And so that's a place where I think the U.S. government has to be helpful, not just on the front line, but in helping country by country. My line is, before we're going to influence human rights in Beijing, we better influence human rights in Brussels, because on a lot of these policies, Brussels ain't our allies. And we really need to work much more effectively as a government and as a private sector collectively to bring about change.
Christine, Christine, can I just,
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
epilogue on Bangladesh? Having a couple of thoughts came to mind as Marcela. I'm really glad Marcela brought that up, because I think this is an example. PVH has now set the bar through this MOU, and there are some, and having had the chance to participate with Assistant Secretary Blake and the head of the trafficking office and Mike's colleague in DRL, Karen Hanrahan, on this call on Monday, it was impressive, the mix of brands and others, consultants. Our old friend Doug Kahn was on, who advises companies and so on and so forth. Very impressive mix that DRL and the South Asia Bureau were able to pull together for it. PVH didn't have to be mentioned specifically, this MOU, to know in the backdrop of fire safety, that's now presented a challenge. Some other companies have decided not to sign on. Only one additional company, I think, from Europe has so far. So this is an example of corporate leadership that I think can ratchet up the process, and whether or not others formally sign on to the MOU. A number of people, both brands and civil society groups, Mark Hankin from Solidarity Center is here, who've done a lot of work in Bangladesh, have said that the response to this fire is quite different than 2 years ago when there was another terrible fire there. And whether that's because of the confluence of events, some have said it's because there's going to be a decision in the coming months on whether to launch a better work program through the ILO and International Finance Corporation, and both the government, BGMEA, the Employers Association there, the Business Association there, and other stakeholders are very interested in that. That ties into other labor conditions, union registration, labor law reform, not fire safety specifically, but all this is shining a spotlight, and without PVH having stepped up, I think the dynamics would be quite different. So that's an example of very practical application, a company that decided to take the next step and puts others on notice, again, without taking sides of what the right approach is.
I mean,
Can we stay on Bangladesh for a moment?
Yeah, I'd like to. Let me just throw in one
Sure.
question, then let you add to that. I mean, I think that the Bangladesh example is an example of a great response. But I guess part of what I'm struggling with is it is a response.
Yes.
And you said it's not a surprise. Is it a surprise that this happened, given that there have been these tragic fires for however many years before that? Is it a surprise what happened in Tunisia? And so why wouldn't you put in HTTPS protocols before going in? I mean, there's a proactive.
Christina, I
measure
want
that
to
we need
take
let me,
up on
Can I
that.
just,
Yeah.
Mike, is that
Yeah,
in
well,
keeping with what you?
Well, I think, and I want to ask one question and tell a brief
Yeah.
story, but Mike earlier mentioned Walmart being a very large company, and that's come up here. Was Walmart invited into, and did they
Yes.
participate in the?
Not in, well, they decided not to join the MOU, but Walmart was part of the discussion, and they were trying to undertake their own initiative. But this is what I wanted to tell, that it sort of connects the dots of much of what we did. Why are we now more preemptive? And I think that companies took preemptiveness as putting into place fire safety in the workplace, but their own initiative. There was no conversion, there were not other stakeholders. And when I was involved in 2011, I realized, this was a better factor than many of the others. And I realized there was one element, and it was there is not a culture of fire safety in Bangladesh. So you need to have not only the laws, the programs, etc., but how do you transform? Because the reality is that workers were in a room, in the dining room, and the bells were ringing, but nobody moved. Nobody moved. And then when they start move, fire spreads very, very fast. There was no enough time. So that's an issue. And it was someone, the privilege of being here yesterday, someone mentioned about one of the panelists about the importance to really let it be from within, from the country, bubble up, have the leader, have the champions. Because PVH, we are going to be, my former employer, PVH, while I was there, we facilitated that process, but it has to be engaged internally. Part of the MOU, what I wanted to clarify, it has workers' grievances. Or the idea that if you, for us, who we are Americans and here, if you see something, say something, if you see something in the factory, there should be a mechanism where you can have an action and be preemptive about it. So much of what the body of work that is being done right now is to incorporate the voices of the workers, to make sure that there is a channel to be able to do that. And for the government and BGMEA, the Manufacturers Association, as Eric said, to have a real role. And they haven't taken upon that challenge. They haven't recognized yet that there was a significant issue. The fire 3 weeks ago has changed that, luckily.
So I just wanted to, you started this discussion, I think, by saying what are some of the challenges, and I think it's time horizon, but I think it's culture at the top of a corporation, and management culture, and up to the board and commitment. And I want to tell a brief story because in the past 12 months we've had a lot of success, starting with Microsoft a year ago and Dell and Apple, with taking steps to require and encourage their suppliers to be more do sustainability reporting, to disclose them. It's in response to a shareholder proposal. First place we ever filed it was in fall of 2010. We submitted the proposal to Walmart. We never even got a phone call from them. Now, I'm not saying that this particular solution would have resolved the issue, but what we did, and we have, we're not a small investor in Walmart. We probably have about $300 million invested.
What's their market capitalization?
Well, as a percent, it's probably less than a half. It's about a half or less than a half.
Again, so context.
It's real dollars,
money.
and it's
Absolutely.
at risk. And
of course.
So, we couldn't get their attention, and what we did was we worked with the ILRF, and we brought a former child garment worker from Bangladesh, who's now, Kalpona Akhtar, some people may know her, and she went to, the annual meeting for this company is not in Bentonville, it's in a huge basketball stadium in Fayetteville. And most companies, annual meetings vary, but there's nothing like the Walmart meeting. It's really a pep rally, and there's 16,000 people there. And this is your one opportunity to get in front of a board, particularly for a small shareholder. And so she presented our proposal, and she got up to the microphone, and it was webcast in front of 16,000 people on the board, and said, look, here's the problem. We know when the auditors are coming, and you need to do more. And she humanized it in a way that we tried to send the message, and they said thank you very much and sat down, and there was never any engagement. And it was, in part maybe it was a stunt, but it was a way of trying to engage the company and humanize it at a much higher level of the corporation. I'm encouraged to hear that maybe they're somewhat engaged.
Thank you, Mike. Let me, I just want to take a moment to call everybody's attention to the blueprint, to the Human Rights First blueprint. There was basically recommendations for the next term for the administration, on recommendations for what the U.S. government should be doing, what companies should be doing, and other stakeholders to make sure that companies are respecting and promoting human rights. So, Mike, can I bring you back in just to talk a little bit about some of those, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Sure, absolutely. Just a couple of thoughts here. I think we're being too polite and agreeing with each other too much here, and it's important to sort of put some things on the table. One is that most governments are not very comfortable dealing with these issues. They don't have the internal expertise. There is a general sense, Elliot said there's a lot of, we sort of vary from being in an antagonistic or alien position to being too comfortable with supporting the idea that whatever homegrown companies do, we got to support them. It's not a nuanced, it's not a sophisticated approach. So one of the challenges, I think, for governments is to really create expertise. And then we always have, issues of other competing interests. That's my life. I'm always dealing with something else that's more important. So I think one of the things is to really get a whole of government approach that says the issue of business and human rights is important. We can't ignore the power of the business community, and it's both to promote the market and promote a strong economy, help our economy, help our workers, but also to do it in a way that recognizes that we need rules of the road for the 21st century. We don't have a blueprint internally of how to do that. With companies, I'd say there are three things. One is companies are terribly afraid of controversy that's outside of their control. It's very difficult for companies to subject themselves to public scrutiny and to get involved in contentious issues in ways that they don't have internal control of. Every institution I can think of behaves that way. You want to control the facts, you want to control the narrative. Secondly, there aren't enough companies with leadership at the top, and people like Marcela said several times, she worked 20 years at PVH, and she was a driver in that company until a couple weeks ago in making sure that there was a daily reminder, this is part of what we do. It's an investment of people, of time, of money. And at the end of the day, for a number of companies, a business decision says, we have to be concerned with corporate governance. There are people like Todd Lang that make sure that they do, and there's a commercial case. We have to be concerned with the environment because there's a public constituency that cares about that, and we can do it relatively cost-free. These issues, especially on some of the labor issues and others, there's a cost. And so part of the hard question here is, what's a reasonable cost for a company that's in business? Its business is to make money. How do you factor this in a way that's real? For the NGO sector, last comment, I'm going to stop. I think it's really important that there be this space to have this conversation. There has been too much of a dichotomy. Business thinks one side. It's the role of a lot of NGOs to kind of get out there and point out the failings of the market and the failings of the business community. That only takes you so far. We need a much more prescriptive look at saying, how does this actually work in a way that recognizes the business realities, but pushes businesses right to the line of what's economically possible, economically, internally, politically. Companies need to be pushed, but they need to be pushed in ways that resonate within the floors of their own company so that there's a buy-in on this.
And finding that sweet spot where it actually isn't a conflict, right? Where it's in the long-term interest of
or
of
it's
the
a
company.
manageable conflict.
Yeah. All right. Good. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions from the floor. Yeah, in the back. If you could identify yourself, please.
Yeah, Len Rubenstein from the Center for Public Health and Human Rights at Johns Hopkins. I want to thank the panelists, and especially Mike, for your leadership over these years at the Human Rights Bureau. And I want to ask you in particular about bringing this question home of business responsibility. I'm sure through your intervention at some level, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food is coming for a visit to the United States in 2013. And there's an opportunity to engage American corporations on the whole U.S. food production system and human rights, from issues around marketing practices and worker rights and environmental sustainability. And we can be sure that the NGOs and civil society will be kicking up some dust. But what can the U.S. government do to promote knowledge and engagement on the Ruggie principles in connection with this visit to advance this important right, which you've had so much to do with promoting? That's an easy one.
It's a good question. One of the things that Secretary Clinton has said that I feel I'm proud to work for a lot of reasons. But one of the things she said from the get-go is we need to lead by example. And we are constantly having internal discussions. They're not always, there's not always complete agreement about how to deal with UN rapporteurs or visits like that. But I think there is a recognition when we did the Universal Periodic Review to the UN Human Rights Council, we didn't do it as a kind of paper drill. We had 16 sessions around the country looking at a whole range of issues. We brought in, as you know, 1,000 activists to talk to us about what we're doing wrong, and we've stayed with that process. So this, to me, is part of a larger set of discussions. If we're going to lead by example, we need to lead by example. We can't just say it, we've got to do it. We lost an opportunity yesterday or the day before when the Senate failed to vote to ratify the Convention on Disability Rights. My God, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 20 years ago. We've led the world on this, and yet we haven't had the political will to basically stand up for that and make that part of our international human rights approach. But I agree with you. I think on these sorts of issues, it's important for us in a way with an interagency focus to say, what are we going to do, not just because a rapporteur is coming, but because these are issues that we ought to be dealing with on our own terms, because we ought to lead by example and show the world that these are things we care about.
Yes, here, please. Is there a mic? Oh, yeah.
Sorry to ask another question. I'm Marianne Stein with the Fund for Global Human Rights. Thanks to you, Mike. And I've enjoyed the conversation so far, but we've been focusing a lot on safety issues, et cetera, and garment industries. One of, it seems to me, the biggest threats to human rights are the extractive industries. And many of us are very much aware of some of the conflicts that they're fueling, but also, in my opinion, there is essentially a rape of the riches of some of the very poorest countries in the world, where people don't have enough to eat, they don't have health services, they don't have jobs, they don't have education, and yet underground, their countries are really quite rich, but their leadership is also quite corrupt, and international corporations take advantage of this, come in, for instance, in Guatemala, Goldcorp, which is mining gold out of, I think, one of the largest mines in the world, is contributing 1% of its profits to the country, and not much is coming of it. And these are non-renewable resources. So for many reasons, it seems to me, those of us who care about human rights, about migration, about 20 different issues, need to be concerned about it. My understanding is that, I think it's Norway, has set an example that doesn't seem to be being followed much of any place, of requiring a much higher percentage, I believe over 50%, of the profits to be paid to the state and to a particular fund that is funding education, health, social services, et cetera. So my question really to Mike is do you see anything that could be done to promote this example and attempt to really have a major change in terms of many of the issues that we are concerned about?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised, Marion, the issue of extractives, because it's a huge challenge. 2.5 years ago, we took over the chair of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. There are 7 or 8 governments involved in that, with about 20 oil and mining companies looking at security issues in the mining and oil industries. And we're right now, the Dutch are the chair of it. We've moved quite a bit in the direction of creating a real organization and beginning to look at key performance indicators and beginning a monitoring process. It has been a real struggle, and some governments, including the one you just mentioned, have not been helpful at all. We are really struggling. The Swiss have been fantastic. Australia's about to join, but some of our European partners have been missing in action on this. And so, and American companies, the American oil companies are, let me say, not in the place that some of the mining companies are, who recognize a responsibility here. We got a lot of work to do in this industry. It happened most recently in the Eastern Congo, where 8 governments have been in there with their armies fighting for what's underground. It's Africa's war. 5 million people have been killed in the Congo, some by death by malnutrition and the like, but it's all because of fighting for resources under the ground. We've got a lot of work to do diplomatically, but companies also have to kick in. Eric mentioned the Dodd-Frank bill. There are lots of elements, but one of them is a requirement that American-based companies report to us on what's happening and how they're extracting some of those resources from under the ground. So there's a lot of different initiatives here, but this is an area where there's a lot of work to be done.
And there's tremendous pushback from the corporate community on that requirement.
Right.
Just 2 seconds on that Dodd-Frank provision, because I think to be a little provocative, and this has nothing to do with the role and responsibility of the Labor Department, which doesn't have any jurisdiction in this area, but those who aren't familiar, I can't believe I've been in D.C. for 27 years, and one of the things that frustrates me at times is this goes back to some of the questions asked of Marcela earlier about corporate organization. There is a huge gap between what some companies are doing individually at headquarters on these things and what their trade associations here in D.C. are communicating. And as I look to the right in the Capitol, that was a pretty modest provision, Section 1502 of Dodd-Frank. It took a while for the SEC, under a lot of pressure, to finally issue regulations, and now they're being sued by major business trade associations, not just on that, but also on Section 1504 dealing with transparency and reporting and disclosure. So for those who are based in D.C., it's a constant challenge. You find that when you're talking to individual companies, and some of the investors and some of civil society groups, Global Witness and others, have pressed some of the companies to explain how they can be engaging, in some cases very productively, with Undersecretary Otero and others on things when they are members of trade associations that are fighting back against even these modest efforts to try to improve disclosure, in this case dealing with conflict minerals. It's a real problem.
But if I can just jump in on one other footnote here. I was in Nigeria a couple weeks ago. I met with the representatives of some of the American and European oil companies. There's a way also to use business as an ally on this. Shell, it was one of the biggest oil companies in the world, very involved in Nigeria. They spend globally $1 billion a year on security. A third of that is in Nigeria. A third of it's in Nigeria because there's so much stealing of their product. They call it bunkering. They're losing about 20% of everything they produce. So they're hiring the Nigerian police and training them because they have no other way to provide security. So one of the things we started to talk to these oil companies about is how do we work with you on a human rights agenda, because it's actually in your business interest, it's in everybody's interest that these issues are addressed in a serious way. We need to be looking for those opportunities to reinforce the best instincts of companies that are doing things for their own commercial reasons, but coming up against things, again, rule of law. It's a lack of rule of law, a lack of so much corruption. It's really in their interest to think about with us, how do we have a human rights agenda?
Great. I think we're actually pretty much out of time. I want to give our panelists each a moment to give one sentence, if you could, on what do you think needs to happen for companies to better promote and respect human rights? You can answer that. It's broad, whether it's from a particular stakeholder group or from your own role. What needs to happen? Mike?
You didn't prep me for that one.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry.
We come at it from 20,000 feet, so I don't have sort of the in the weeds expertise, but from our perspective, and for us, it's we want companies to succeed, but over the long term, it's making the link of why it's in their business interest. And there may be instances, where there are costs and that there may be lines where that becomes a challenge. For us, it's up to that line where it is in their interest and our interest. And our interests diverge from some other investors, including, flash traders who own for 1 second or the average holding period shorter. And some investors don't care. But I hope that companies and boards are more responsive to their long-term owners. The point about quarterly guidance is well taken. How do you, if you shift the thinking in the executive suite and in the boardroom to a longer term focus, hopefully many of these issues become material or potentially material.
Thank you. Long term. Elliot, one sentence.
Okay. The U.S. government needs to work more closely with private companies around the world to generate support for human rights, at least in the internet sector, among civil society and governments in countries that are not clearly committed to those values.
Well done. Thank you. Good sentence. Mike?
One sentence. We're in a new frontier here, and whether you're here as an NGO, Human Rights First and others, or representing an investor or a business person or in government, recognize that we are just at the beginning of this journey. and to create rules of the road for the 21st century is all of our collective responsibility. It's not too late to be part of this. You're in at the ground floor of a discussion that's going to be one of the true human rights issues of the 21st century.
Great.
Long sentence.
It's all right, Marcela.
I can, with my Christmas or Hanukkah, whatever place you are, list for the government and for both of you. The first is, please do continue, working government to government in meaningful dialogue and action. A good example is what the Department of Labor has been doing with Bangladesh to promote legislative reform. That has been very helpful because companies by ourselves cannot do it. I need global and field support, and network examples too, what is being done at the Department of Labor in terms of the tools to prevent child labor, to help smaller, medium, and large companies to know and to have the tools of what good looks like and how to prevent these practices. I would like to have a repository of better practices. I mean, there's a lot of programs around, and I don't want to duplicate or recreate or reinvent the wheel.
Great,
So
thank
please
you.
do that.
All right, Eric, last word.
Okay, so I've been going way off on outside Labor Department jurisdiction on my comment about trade associations. I'll come back to something more parochial, which is we'd like to see, and I'm thinking of this work we're doing in Haiti with different stakeholders, we'd like to see companies recognize that leadership and respect for stronger labor standards and protection of worker rights is a win-win in terms of advancing trade and investment in a country. That, in other words, you can build a stronger Made in Haiti brand if you are a leader in respecting and advancing worker rights at the same time as you're gaining access to a market and they're gaining access to our market through trade preferences. It's not, more labor rights takes away from opportunities for trade and investment. It's a more sustainable way of doing it. And we're starting to see that from officials and different perspectives, including on the ground, a place there. But the more companies that kind of lead that, carry that mantra of win-win, I think the better off we can advance both objectives, trade and labor.
Eric, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.